Hey, Cookies here, and this is a quick start Mythic Plus guide for Resto Druid. So let's jump right into it with the talents. If you want like a TLDR version without me explaining and going in depth like I did in the Shaman video, here's the talents that you should run in M Plus as a general rule. With that being said, I'm going to kind of break down each row and talk about them and just give kind of notes and stuff like that, because there are circumstances where you might want to play other stuff or switch talents or do things like that. So first off, Cenarion Ward is our default pick because it's just a very good heal for what it is. It's one global and it gives you a very, very big heal on, typically you'll be using this on the tank. And then the other option is Abundance. You can take this if you feel like you need more kind of overall group healing, I guess. So if you find yourself having to press Regrowth a lot to heal people, and you know you're like having things like mana issues, or if you are just finding it hard to keep the group as a whole alive, the tank's totally fine, but the group keeps falling apart, Abundance is going to be like your kind of, I guess you could say, like triage healing talent or group healing talent. And then Nourish doesn't get taken. The reason for this is because it stacks off your mastery and gives like a ton of extra bonus. It's another thing to cast, so it's just another regrowth. Regrowth already does what Nourish does, the same exact amount. It's just that Nourish will overheal the person rather than anything. If you have all your hots on someone and you press Regrowth, it will full heal them. So you don't need Nourish to do that for you because Regrowth already does it. Next up in the second row, Wild Charge is going to be your go-to choice. It just gives you the most versatility, and it just has like the most amount of flexible uses, so it's really, really good. I do see a lot of Druids always taking Renewal. I really don't think it's necessary. You're really tanky as it is as a Resto Druid, or just as a Druid in general. You have Health Pot. Depending if you have a Warlock, you have a Hellstone, you have Bear Form, you have Conduits, you have all these things that make you survive so much that Renewal just feels... If you have to press Renewal, you're probably just not pressing a different button to keep you alive, like Bark Skin or Bear Form or something like that. So Tiger Dash can also be useful if you just want to have that added like mobility every 45 seconds of like a really big sprint. So for any particular bosses, I can't think of any off the top of my head. That's why I just take Wild Charge as a default. And then the next row for affinities, you're either gonna go for Balance or Feral Affinity if you're planning on doing any damage whatsoever in your group, because Guardian will not allow you to do that. Guardian is like the tankiest and safest option, but if you want to be able to do damage, which you really should as a Resto Druid, because that's what we excel at, is being able to weave damage and like trade off damage for healing. It's like a high risk, high reward type of gameplay. Feral Affinity is usually the default, but honestly, Balance Affinity works just as well. It's really whatever you prefer. I find Feral much more fun, but Balance will do almost the same amount of damage. I think if you're like comparing the two, it really depends on Covenant and stuff, but I guess the easiest way to break it down is Night Fae is the best if you go Balance Affinity and use every single Convoke or damage in Balance Affinity form rather than, or in Moonkin form, I should say, rather than using the Convoke to heal people. But as soon as you use a Convoke to heal people, that Balance Affinity starts losing value very, very fast. So Balance Affinity, take that if you're going to go Night Fae and press every single Convoke as a damage Convoke rather than as a healing Convoke. And then for all other Covenants and Night Fae, if you plan to heal with your Convoke, then you play Feral Affinity. And if you plan to do like a mix, like sometimes you're going to do damage with the Convoke, sometimes you're going to do healing, Feral is also your best choice, I feel like. But again, play around with both. I'm not the lawmaker of what are the best talents. This is just what I prefer and what I find to work for me. Next up, Heart of the Wild is the only talent that increases your damage done, so we take this by default. You can find use for Mass Entanglement in a few dungeons, like in Plaguefall to stop the slimes on the first boss, but usually it's nicer to find a different class or a different spec of Druid to utilize this, because we lose damage by taking Mass Entanglement or Mighty Bash. But again, if you find uses for Mass Entanglement and Mighty Bash could be useful for like if you're in a pug group and things just are not getting interrupted and everyone's dying, then Mighty Bash is a great pick because it just gives you added utility to help stop cast and crowd control mobs and stuff like that. Next row, we have Soul of the Forest as our default. This just makes it where every time we press Swift Mend, our next heal is going to be have like some added juice to it, and that's very, very good. Cultivation is okay, but you won't see it heal for too much. But it can be a solid passive option if you don't like utilizing Soul of the Forest or thinking about it too much, which really you don't have to. But if you don't like the idea of Soul of the Forest, Cultivation's a great alternative passive talent. And then lastly, Incarnation Tree of Life. You would really only take this if you feel like you're struggling on healing on any specific bosses. So like say you're doing a Tyrannical Plaguefall and you just can't seem to kill the first boss or the last boss, or you find yourself struggling and you're starting to push higher and higher keys, you can go ahead and throw Incarnation Tree of Life on and it can definitely help. But obviously it is like, it's not technically a damage loss, but it is in a sense, because you're like pressing a 3-minute cooldown and kind of committing yourself for the next 30 seconds to healing. And if you're not, then you're losing value rapidly on this talent. So that's the only problem with it, is why it's not like super, super popular. But if you feel like you need more healing, Incarnation Tree of Life is going to give you the most healing. Next up, Spring Blossoms is the go-to. This just adds another hot to our toolkit to benefit our passive mastery even more. Even if we're not building any mastery, like I have 100 mastery, and it's still very good to have just an extra hot that you can just throw down on the tank and stuff like that, and it does a lot of passive healing. And because a lot of the time you have melee DPS, or you're in melee, or the group is like more condensed on like boss fights and stuff, you can usually get this going on every single player in the group and can be really beneficial for, again, like bosses and stuff like that. Inner Peace, we shouldn't be casting Trank too often, but it does have a nice benefit of immune to knockbacks and 20% reduced damage while channeling it now, which was a buff that was recently implemented. So it can be a solid talent. So if you feel like Spring Blossoms, like you're not getting much out of it, or people are standing outside of it, or it's too hard to keep up on, then Inner Peace is a fine option as well, because it just allows you to have Trank more often and gives you some kind of benefit to where, like, again, on bosses, you can channel it and take reduced use it as like a defensive, basically, and kind of rotate it with your Bark Skin and Iron Bark and stuff like that. And then lastly, Overgrowth. I haven't really played with it too much. I'm sure it can be fine to like kind of throw all your hots on the tank at once and not have to like spend time like building up and ramping on the tank before going back into like cat weaving or boomkin weaving and stuff like that. So it is viable, but again, it doesn't add anything to our toolkit. It just gives us a button that kind of throws everything all at once at someone, when Spring Blossoms and Inner Peace actually add things to, like give us power, like player power. This doesn't really give us anything. It's just, hey, hit this button and it'll cast 4 spells at once for you, kind of thing. Last row, I see a lot of people always take Germination. You should not do this. Germination is a very bad talent because of how much time you have to commit to make it useful. You have to commit 2 globals just to make it useful on one person. So if we add, 5 people in the dungeon group, that's 10 globals in order to make this talent even worth taking in the first place. And it's just not worth it. If you really, really want the healing benefit from it, or you just plan to do literally 0 damage and you take like Tree of Life and you just don't care about doing damage whatsoever in the key, and you're totally fine timing keys that way, then Germination, sure, go for it if you like it. But otherwise, you can get all the same benefits of Germination from Flourish. You can just increase the amount that your hots are healing for and how fast they're healing for and all that stuff, and extending them by just having Flourish every minute and a half for those like damage patterns or damage spikes on bosses and trash packs and stuff like that. So Flourish is your go-to just because it allows us to have a nice like group-wide burst heal to keep up and keep ahead of damage patterns that are happening. But Photosynthesis is also a solid option if you feel like you need more tank healing, because that's generally what it's for, is just to keep the tank more topped up while we are doing damage in like Balance or Feral Affinity. So that is all the talents. Now we will go to the Covenant and Legendary combos. So for Covenant and Legendaries, I will try to keep this as simple as I can. Druid has a lot of options, so I'm just going to try to go over like the main options. First off, the best combo at the moment is Necrolord and Draught of Deep Focus because of the Kyrian nerfs that happened. So Draught of Deep Focus is, I guess I could just look in here. Drought of Defocus just increases your single target damage really heavily, which makes you really good at priority damage in packs or on bosses specifically is what it's mostly for. It just makes you very, very strong at kitty weaving. But if you're doing balance affinity for any reason, you do not want Drought of Defocus because specifically you want to have Moonfire, Rake, Rip, and you want those 3 effects on the target because they're all getting increased effect. If you don't have access to Rake and Rip, which you don't unless you have Feral Affinity, you would definitely not want this legendary because it would only boost your Moonfire. So that wouldn't be very useful. So that's the first combo is Necrolord plus Drought of Defocus for damage. And then that would be Kitty Weaving. And then the next one is Kyrian and any legendary. You could use Drought of Defocus if you want some Feral Affinity damage and single target damage. You could take Circle of Life and Death if you want more if you want like a little bit of benefit in damage and a little bit of benefit in healing. And I'll quickly just run through the other legendaries that are totally fine to take. This is more if you want healing in your Mythic Plus experience. So if you're struggling with healing or you don't really care again about damage, then Memory of the Mother Tree is a solid legendary to take. Verdant Infusion is like the best healing legendary to take in M+ generally. And then that's pretty much it as far as the healing legendaries go. So Kyrian, you could play any legendary as your secondary. It really doesn't matter. But again, if you wanted like to min-max, then it would probably be Kyrian plus Kitty Weaving with the Drought of Defocus. And then lastly, we have Night Fae and the Oath of the Elder Druid legendary. I haven't tested this myself yet. I probably will play around with it a little bit. It has potential, but again, this could be subject to change and it might just be awful. But if you have the 1-minute Convoke legendary and then you also have Oath of the Elder Druid on, it lets you shift into balance form and get a Heart of the Wild Convoke for damage every single minute. The only slight issue I see with this is that people are taking the cooldown guy at the moment. So people are killing out of the relics, and that makes it to where your Convoke is a typically 40-second cooldown instead of a 1-minute cooldown, but it won't reduce the cooldown of Oath of the Elder Druid as far as I know, which means that now it's going to be off. It's going to be off because your wild spirits, or not wild spirits, your Convoke is going to come back off cooldown, and your Oath of the Elder Druid will still be on cooldown. And that means you're wasting all that potential from the CDR from So that's the only problem with it, but it could be really fun to play around with, and you could just take a bunch of, like you could take Karain in the Night Fae Soulbind tree and just like have crazy burst damage with the Oath of the Elder Druid and the Celestial Spirits. So it might be fun to play around with. You could check it out. Just be aware of the CDR thing. It kind of ruins it a little bit, but again, it's still totally usable. So those are the main Covenant and Legendary combos. As far as Soulbinds go, like I just said for Night Fae, Rain is going to be like your go-to if you want burst damage. You can take Dreamweaver if you want more healing. Also, Naya is really good for healing. And then for Necrolord, I believe we go with Plague Deviser Merilith, and that's just because he gives the most amount of damage because of this trait right here. You take this first row, and he gives you 12% damage done for the first 15 seconds of like everything you attack, which is, I mean, that's just insane for like bosses and stuff, especially when we have Drought of Defocus and like Lust going. It just makes those dots like ramp so hard. And then lastly, for if you were to play Kyrian, you would always want Mechanicos so that your Kyrian ability cools down as fast as possible when you're linked to somebody else. So that's for Soulbinds. I guess we can go over Conduits really fast, so let's just look at this. So for Conduits, Druids have very, very, very good Endurance Conduits. You have Well-Honed Instincts, which gives you a Frenzied Regen when you get low HP, which basically just full heals you. You have Innate Resolve, which also synergizes with Well-Honed Instincts. Oh my gosh, I can't talk. Sorry, I'm talking too fast. Okay, need to catch a breath. You also have Innate Resolve, which synergizes with Well-Honed Instincts, and then it also just increases your own self-healing with regrowth on yourself. And then you also have Tough as Bark, you have Ursine Vigor. Like every single endurance conduit for Druid is very, very good. So you want as many endurance as you can get without sacrificing other things like potency and stuff. Like here I have a potency available, but I take this because I actually get more damage from here. And then really the only things you want as far as potencies go is the whatever your covenant your covenant conduit is. Always take that because it's very good for all of them. And then unstoppable growth is the only other one you'll really take. You don't really need any of these other ones. Flash of clarity can be okay if you have three potency conduits, but I would honestly try to take like just 2 potency conduits, and you just use covenant conduit plus unstoppable growth, and then the rest should just be finesse and endurance conduits. So that's it for Soulbinds and conduits. Next up, we talk about stat priorities for Resto Druid. So just like all the healers, I'm going to say the same thing. You should really just equip item level and spend your brain power on playing the game really well and like learning the class and learning how to do, you know, the dungeons and mechanics and stuff really well rather than worrying about your stats. But I will break down the stats as best I can and just go over what each of them benefit and what each of them are bad at. And then you can decide for yourself what kind of stats you want to go for. Cool. So here we go. So critical strike. It is a solid option for doing damage, and it is a average option for doing healing. It's not very good, but it's not super bad. It's just that crit usually benefits healing when you're in a larger raid group because of things like Tranquility and Wild Growth and like all these spells that affect more people than we have in a party of 5. That's where crit really shines. But either way, it's a very solid damage talent or damage stat. Next up, we have versatility. This gives you very high damage, similar to crit, and it gives you pretty low healing. I would say it does not benefit your healing very much at all, but you do get the added benefit of good survivability because of the damage reduction from versatility. Next up, you have mastery, which gives you 0 damage whatsoever, but it is your highest healing stat. So if you feel like you are lacking in healing, take some mastery. If you feel like you are already healing plenty enough and you don't feel like you need the added help and you want to increase your damage in dungeons, get rid of all your mastery if possible. The less mastery you have, the more damage you will do. And then lastly, we have haste, which is going to be probably our highest damage stat and also a very solid healing stat because it increases the duration, or it increases like how many ticks of dots and hots and all these things we get and how fast we can cast them, because as Resto Druid, you are casting a lot and spending a lot of globals and doing a lot of instant cast things because you need to, you know, apply hots, and then you need to switch forms, and then you need to use kitty weaving abilities or cast spells with the boomkin weaving and stuff like that. So haste is a very, very good stat to have. You want almost as much as you can possibly get. And then once you start feeling comfortable, I usually start feeling comfortable around like 30% haste. That's when I start switching over and trying to get more crit and more versatility. And I typically avoid mastery just because I want to do as much damage as I possibly can. So that is all the stats. I think that covers everything in this quick start guide. So thank you so much for watching. I hope it was helpful. I hope it was easy to follow along. Please give tips so that when I make future ones of this like series in the next expansion and stuff like that, so that I can make them as, you know, watchable and enjoyable as possible so that you can get the information you're looking for. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.